So for the last month, like many of you, I've watched the conflict in Ukraine unfold with both heartbreak and sadness. And for the first time really in my professional life, I've also spent this time fielding questions from friends and family about the risks of nuclear war. I'm someone who focuses on US and Russian nuclear policy. So I do spend a lot of my time thinking about how and why the two largest nuclear weapon states could and should work together to reduce the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. In the last 5 weeks, as you can imagine, this work has become both more difficult and more urgent than ever before. So let me start by asking the question that I think is on many of our minds. What is the likelihood that nuclear weapons will actually be used in the course of the war in Ukraine? Now, there are different scenarios under which this could happen, some of which I think are potentially more realistic than others. But in general, I agree with many of my colleagues in the nuclear community that the risk remains low, but not zero. Now, it's worth remembering here at the outset that nuclear weapons are already being used in this conflict, just maybe not in the ways that you might be thinking. What I mean by this is that Russia is a nuclear armed state and NATO is a nuclear alliance, and the two sides are using their nuclear arsenals to deter one another as we speak. Since the Cold War, both sides have been held in check by an understanding that the first use of nuclear weapons would result in a devastating retaliatory strike. What that means is that the threat of nuclear weapons use is a part of our daily lives. It's just not one that seems to us to be very tangible or immediate. What I think has scared a lot of people I've heard from over the last month are the implicit and explicit nuclear threats that Putin and his senior officials have been using for compellence purposes in this conflict. On the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we heard Putin promise to bring consequences such as you have never seen in your entire history against anyone who would seek to stand in his way. On February 28th, he placed Russia's forces on what he called a special regime of combat duty, a confusing phrase that was not immediately clear to many of us looking in from the outside. Still, the message from the Kremlin to the West was hard to misinterpret. You'd better think twice before intervening against Moscow on Kiev's behalf. Now, some of my colleagues in the nuclear policy community believe that Putin's harsh rhetoric is just saber rattling. And I certainly hope that they're right. Since his threats are designed to keep the West out of Ukraine, so the argument goes, Putin would be unlikely to act on these so long as neither the United States nor NATO gets involved in this conflict directly. They support this view with what we in this field call Russian declaratory policy. Those are the documents that describe the circumstances under which Russia might use a nuclear weapon, and they spell out for other countries the red lines that they would need to cross in order to elicit a nuclear response. One of these documents is Russia's military doctrine. It tells us that the Russian Federation reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to their use against it or its allies, or in the case of conventional aggression that would threaten the very existence of the Russian state. Another one of these documents is a presidential decree from 2020 that describes Russia's principles of deterrence. It tells us that Moscow could use nuclear weapons in response to reliable information about a ballistic missile attack against Russia or its allies, or an attack against critical government infrastructure, including that which is associated with nuclear command and control. Now, listening to this, it's true that none of these scenarios sound quite like what we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, and that might seem like encouraging news. In my view, though, I think we need to be careful not to extrapolate too much from these documents about the actual risk of nuclear use in this conflict. That's because Russian declaratory policy is about deterring an attack against Russia, against Russian territory. It's not about deterring interference from adversaries while Russia attacks a third country, which is the situation that we're facing in Ukraine. What I think can be more helpful is to look at the composition of Russian forces overall and what this tells us about how Moscow envisions using nuclear weapons in war. We can see from this that Russia's conventional capabilities have improved significantly over the last decade, but that it still relies heavily on nuclear weapons to manage the risk of escalation in a conflict. Russia's nuclear strategy suggests that it would use nuclear weapons only after it had run out of tools for conventional escalation and was unwilling to back down in the face of an existential threat. In contrast, what some scholars in the West have argued, it seems unlikely to me that Russia would automatically resort to using nuclear weapons to win a conventional war. Now, these insights are useful and encouraging, but they still leave us with a lot of unanswered questions. For me, these things are: what might Russia decide it needed to do if its conventional options had been exhausted? And when might Putin himself consider that an existential threat had been invoked, and particularly in the course of this conflict? It's very hard to find answers to these questions when we're looking from the outside in, but these questions are worth asking and they matter. That's because when people, whether policymakers or the general public, feel like they're faced with no good options, they become more likely and more willing to take big risks. As the situation becomes worse for Putin with the implementation of sanctions, increasing international isolation, and an unexpectedly difficult situation on the ground, his willingness to resort to nuclear use could rise. That makes for an incredibly delicate situation for policymakers in the West, who have to figure out how to enact punitive measures against Russia without simultaneously increasing the risk of escalation. For my part, when I've listened to Putin speak over the last 5 weeks, I've heard someone who believes that he can use nuclear threats to move up and down the escalation ladder in ways that suit his needs. From the standpoint of somebody who studies nuclear risk like myself, this is one part of this conflict that worries me a lot, especially at a time when Russia and Western forces are in close physical proximity as they are now. Ambiguous signals raise the risk of miscalculations and misinterpretations. That's the kind of situation where we could see the accidental use of nuclear weapons, even when that's not an outcome that either side would want. Now, fortunately, there are some mechanisms that are already in place, which are designed to reduce the risk that nuclear weapons would be used in scenarios like these. One of these is a direct communication link between the presidents of Russia and the United States. This so-called hotline was put in place in 1963 in the aftermath of probably the most significant nuclear close call in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. During 13 terrifying days in October of 1962, Kennedy and his advisors often found that communicating with Moscow through the diplomatic channels they had established was just too slow and clumsy. They needed ways of getting in touch right away with their Soviet counterparts to prevent things from getting out of hand. Now, some people have looked at this history and asked if Russia's war against Ukraine could help to convince policymakers that we need more tools to reduce the risk of nuclear use today. While it's possible that that will happen, and I certainly think that it should, I'm afraid that it's not going to be that easy. The historical record tells us that things are likely to get much worse for nuclear diplomacy before they're going to get better. This will be true even if this crisis shows policymakers and the public why it's more necessary than ever to engage with one another. I think that the highest barrier to overcome in this environment will be the anger and mistrust that now define the US and Russian relationship. This was certainly true of the post-Cuban Missile Crisis period, where similar emotions stood in the way of arms control negotiations for the better part of a year. In a similar environment, it's going to be hard for arms controllers on either side to show the kinds of flexibility necessary to reach an agreement today. It also makes it more likely that nuclear diplomacy will be held hostage to the crisis in US-Russian relations, even if actors on both sides can understand intellectually why avoiding an arms race is in their best interest. You may believe me, you may not, but you don't have to take my word for this. We're already seeing some of these impacts play out today. The US, for example, has suspended its strategic stability dialogue with Russia. And the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, has suggested that Moscow could withdraw from the only remaining arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, the New START treaty, in response to US and European sanctions. Now, these developments aren't unexpected, but they come at a time when the future of arms control is precarious. The longer talks are paused, the more difficult, in my view, it will become, both from a political and bureaucratic standpoint, to return to the negotiating table. What's more, for some, this crisis will serve as a lesson about the importance of having a strong nuclear deterrent, and not necessarily about the risks of nuclear use that come with it. In this environment, there's no guarantee that the Senate would ratify a new US-Russia arms control agreement, even if the two sides were able to conclude one. The good news is that deliberate and persistent efforts on the parts of policymakers in both Washington and Moscow can go a long way towards overcoming these barriers. That was true 60 years ago, and it's still true today. In fact, the thing that ultimately broke the arms control and risk reduction stalemate between the United States and the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis was President Kennedy's declaration of a unilateral moratorium on nuclear testing. That's what allowed the two sides to come back to the negotiating table, and that's what ushered in one of the most prodigious periods in bilateral arms control history. We don't have a sense for how this conflict will end, which makes it hard to say when or even if there will be political will for this kind of work on either side. In the meantime, it's going to be up to arms control supporters, both inside and outside government, to try to sustain enthusiasm for these efforts in the mid to long term. That's why, in my view, now more than ever, we need a next generation of nuclear experts with the creativity, the know-how, and the tenacity to take up this mantle. In an environment where almost nothing is certain, one of the few things we know for sure is that nuclear dangers aren't going away anytime soon. Thank you.